Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fourth plenary session of our conference. I hope you're enjoying it, having good exchanges and possibly new sources of inspiration. It is a true honor and pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Robert Costanza, Professor of Ecological Economics at the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College, London. Bob, as he signs his email, is one of the founding figures in the field of ecological economics and a strong advocate for rethinking how we measure progress, value nature, and design economies that serve both people and the planet. He is the recipient of the 2024 Blue Planet Prize, an international award presented to recognize outstanding individuals or organizations that have made significant contributions to scientific research and its application in solving global environmental problems. In case you don't know, the Blue Planet Prize, it is often referred to as the Nobel Prize for Environmental Science, and it underlines the depth of Bob's intellectual and practical contributions to knowledge and actions that have helped shaping the global sustainability agenda for over 4 decades. Professor Costanza contributed to more than 600 scientific articles and 30 books. His work has been cited over 160,000 times and featured extensively in both academic and popular media. His most recent book, Addicted to Growth: Societal Therapy for a Sustainable Wellbeing Future, addresses what he refers to as our addiction to economic growth at all costs. Bob recognizes that our economic system is dysfunctional and proposes a strategy to promote shared values and a collective vision to create economies that promote true well-being and sustainability as a way forward. He is co-founder and past president of the International Society for Ecological Economics, ambassador of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, member of the Club of Rome, founding editor of the Journal of Ecological Economics, and currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the Anthropocene Review. What makes Professor Costanza's work especially meaningful to us here at ISCOLS is his keen ability to integrate the ecological, economic, and social dimensions of human life. He is not only concerned with planetary boundaries and systems modeling, but also with the social, cultural, and psychological barriers that prevent us from building the future we want and need. His approach is multidisciplinary, compassionate, and committed to build a better future for all, and as such, it resonates strongly with the mission of our society. I first heard about Costanza's work when I was a young student of environmental economics at the University of Siena, about 20 years ago. At the time, I wanted to be a journalist, and this tells you, you want to make God laugh, tell him about your plans. But then, destiny is fun. Today I have the unique opportunity to welcome to the stage Professor Costanza. It's a great honor for me and a privilege for me. Please join me at the podium for your speech titled Creating a Sustainable Wellbeing Future for Humans and the Rest of Nature. And with this, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. That was one of the best introductions I think I've ever had. So thanks very much for that. And I hope everyone has a high level of subjective well-being at the moment, and maybe I can even improve it a bit with this talk about how do we actually get there? How do we create this sustainable well-being future for humans and the rest of nature? And I put it in that form just to emphasize that it's not humans and nature as separate things. It's humans and the rest of nature. We're all part of this integrated system. There we go. And I think you probably all heard this term, the Anthropocene, just to recognize the magnitude of human impact on the planet these days. We don't live in an empty world any longer. We now live in what Herman Daly has called a full world, full of humans and their artifacts and their impacts on the planet in various ways. And I think the bottom line implication of that is that business as usual is no longer an option. We really need to change how we think about things if our goal is to create a sustainable and desirable Anthropocene. We need to think and act differently. And it's an opportunity as well. I mean, the time is now, really, to build economies that have a different goal, have a goal of sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature, rather than the single-minded pursuit of GDP growth at all costs, which is now getting us into quite some trouble, as I'll say. And to achieve this sustainable well-being future, I think we need these three elements in a more integrated way. First of all, having a vision of how the world is, our scientific understanding of how the world functions, and I think at multiple scales. And certainly we've learned a lot about the Earth system and how it functions, but we've also learned a lot about human psychology and how it functions, what actually does contribute to human well-being, and the other side of it, how do we make that well-being sustainable? We don't want to sustain a poor system. We want to create and sustain a high well-being system. But we also need an adequate vision of how we would like the world to be. What are our goals for the future? What does that sustainable well-being future actually look like? And how is that a better place for people to exist? So I think I'll get back to that. But we also need our tools and analytical techniques to be consistent with this changing vision, changing understanding. And I think that's going to require a lot more systems thinking and modeling. How do we understand this whole integrated system? Not just the pieces one at a time, but how are the pieces all interconnected and how do they function over time? And I think our implementation strategies also need to be different. And we need, I think, to develop new kinds of institutions, especially ones that can better manage our common assets, our social and our natural capital going forward. And I think to overcome this addiction is going to take some societal therapy. And we have to talk about what would that look like. Anyway, back to the the vision of how the world functions. We know that the world is a complex, nonlinear, adaptive system. There are thresholds, there are tipping points, there are surprises. This is just a graph of some of the potential climate tipping points that could cause the climate to really change quite quickly. You've heard about the ice sheets melting, but there's many other potential tipping points in the climate system. So understanding how the biophysical world works, I think, is certainly advancing, and we're understanding exactly how complex that system is and how we need to manage it in a more integrated way. We also recognize that there are fundamental ecological constraints. There are planetary boundaries. Who's heard this term before, just to get a feel for this audience? Okay, I'd say at least half of you, more than half. Okay, good. So you know about that. You also probably have heard about, well, this is just the most recent version of that, which estimated that there were already outside the safe operating space on 6 out of these 9 planetary boundaries that have been identified, including obviously climate change, biodiversity loss, land system change, fresh-water, biogeochemical flows, et cetera, novel entities. So we're in dangerous territory in terms of the future, the biophysical future of the planet. And we know we are at a critical threshold because of these potential tipping points, because of our performance outside these critical boundaries. We could go over the edge into what's been called a hothouse Earth, from which there's probably no coming back. And it's a climate system that humans have never been subjected to over the entire Holocene period. And the Holocene period was a very stable climate period that really allowed human civilization to be created. So now in the Anthropocene, our challenge is really to move to this more stabilized Earth system, stabilize the climate going forward. So, unfortunately, that's not the movie that most people or many people are lining up to go see. These are inconvenient truths, and how do we change that system? Simply pointing out how bad the future might be, I think, is not really enough to make the changes that are necessary. So how do we do that? I think the solution is that, first of all, we need a third movie. We need a more positive vision of what this new system could look like that recognizes the interconnection and the embeddedness of the economy within society, within the rest of nature. These are not separate things. These are highly integrated components in this complex Earth system. And I think that recognition first needs to underlie how we create the kind of system, a sustainable and desirable economy in society in the rest of nature. So that's what ecological economics, I think, has been about from the beginning. It's a transdisciplinary field. It's not designed to be a subset of economics. It's really designed to be an integration of ecological thinking, economics, psychology, and earth system science. How do we understand the earth as a complex, integrated ecological system? It is an ecological system. And it has these three integrated questions or goals. First of all, to establish and maintain an ecologically sustainable scale, so staying within planetary boundaries, basically. Second, a socially fair distribution of wealth and resources, both within the current generation of humans, but also between current and future generations, and also between humans and other species. So this whole issue of fairness, of equity, I think has always been a central characteristic because there's a recognition that that's extremely important to well-being at multiple scales, from the individual all the way up to the planet. And finally, have an economically efficient allocation of resources, which has traditionally been the domain of conventional economics, but recognizing that there's a lot more that contributes to well-being than just the market system. So how do we make sure that our natural and social capital contributions are given adequate weight in that allocation system? So if you want to look at it from the planetary boundaries point of view in this diagram, I'm sure many of you have seen some version of this, Kate Rayworth's safe and just donut, that we need to stay within planetary boundaries, but we also need to create the elements of well-being and quality of life within those boundaries. So how do we create the safe and just world, a sustainable and desirable future? And I think that needs to be our fundamental goal for the economy going forward, and for policy going forward, and for our society going forward. And there are several overlapping ideas around this topic, including ecological economics, the well-being economy, the donut economy, steady-state economy, circular bioeconomy. You probably heard many different versions of these things that are often presented as separate, independent things, but I think they share a lot of similarities. You know, even the Chinese idea of ecological civilization, I think, is headed in the right direction. I like the term lagom. I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard that Swedish term, lagom, which means just enough. Everybody has just enough. You know, not too little, not too much. So it's really about equitable distribution, but also not a sacrifice for anybody. So it's a way of talking about it. I was recently part of a paper that tried to look across all of the existing alternatives to conventional economics and come up with a set of principles that they all more or less agree on. And so it came up with these 10 principles that I think are kind of common to all of these alternatives. Starting in the middle with, you know, the need to be holistic, to recognize this embeddedness that I talk about, to need to be truly inter and transdisciplinary, I would say. And then on the ecological, political, and social side, I think there's also a set of principles in each of those areas that recognizes, you know, the limited substitutability of natural capital for other forms of capital, for sustainability, the limits to growth, the necessity of regenerative design, the need to get, you know, beyond GDP and post-capitalism, and et cetera. I don't know if I want to read all of these, but to take a more holistic perspective on people and values, and to focus on equity that I mentioned, et cetera. So you can take a look at that paper if you want more details about that. But maybe we could take a step back for a second and say, well, what's the problem? What's the old vision? Which I think is still the current vision that guides a lot of our policy decisions these days. What does that look like? Well, the traditional factors of production, land, labor, and capital. You can see that land is kind of grayed out here because there's the assumption of almost perfect substitutability between these factors. You don't really need land, natural resources. You just need more labor and capital to produce more GDP that is then either consumed in the short term or reinvested to build more capital in the next period. And that individual utility or welfare is largely a function of how much we consume, right? So what are the basic premises of this vision? That more is always better. GDP is a good proxy for national welfare. In the post-World War II period, when GDP was really coming into prominence, this was probably not a bad assumption. We needed to rebuild the global economies that had been destroyed in World War II. So it was probably a good proxy, at least for a while, but times have changed. And now all the side effects of that GDP growth are really beginning to get in the way. The other premise, I think, here is that this economy can grow forever, that this scale is not an issue. We'll always find some technological way out. So you see nothing in this vision is limiting how big the economy can be. We'll just grow forever. Poverty is best solved with more growth. We don't really need to worry about distribution that much. We'll just make the pie bigger, and then we can figure out how to split it up later. And that's more of a political decision than an economic one. Nature is kind of a sideshow, as I said. We don't really need nature or natural resources, and sometimes it just gets in the way of growth. And private property is always best because we're talking about marketed goods and services which are rival and excludable, sort of easily measured with GDP. So you don't really need to worry about the commons so much. They're just these sort of annoying externalities and relatively small. So private property rights are either private or public, and the emphasis is on privatizing things. So what's wrong with that vision, and what's a better vision of where we are now? And I would present this one, which recognizes that we live in a materially closed Earth system. Everything has to go somewhere, that these four basic types of assets or capital are all required in a more balanced way in order to produce both conventional goods and services, but also to produce well-being more broadly described. So in addition to built capital, our human capital, not just labor, but individual people and everything, that all of their intelligence and et cetera. Social capital, all of our networks of individuals, our governments, our cultures, et cetera, is extremely important. And certainly natural capital, everything in the world that we didn't have to produce, the free gifts of nature, and that they all contribute to well-being in more complicated ways. And we have to also recognize that there are side effects, there are waste side effects, et cetera, and that property rights need to be much more complex. And property rights regimes need to take into account that common property can often be the best way to manage these kinds of assets. Some of these assets. And there's obviously limited substitutability between these different types of capital. So they're, like I said, they're all required in a more balanced way. Okay. And certainly the work on quality of life and well-being has been progressing rapidly, and I guess that's what you all have been involved with for 3 decades now, at least. In particular, the whole idea of subjective well-being and all of the global surveys that have been done, and recognizing, how those are connected to basic human needs, which are much more than simply consumption. So security, affection, understanding, participation. There have been several different versions of this list of subjective well-beings. Manfred Max Neef is one author I've relied on here. But how those needs are fulfilled varies obviously from person to person, from culture to culture, et cetera, and how they're expressed in their subjective well-being surveys. And what we can do, I think, from a policy perspective, though, is to create the opportunities for people to satisfy those needs, to feel the sense of subjective well-being. And that's going to be based on how we manage our assets, our built, our human, our social, our natural capital, and how we use our time. So, and I'll focus a bit now on the environmental contributions, the ecosystem contributions to that sustainable well-being. You may have seen some version of this graph or this diagram from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And okay, let me survey the audience again. Who's heard the term ecosystem services before? Okay, it's fair fraction, good. So I don't have to go into too much detail there. You know that they are the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems and how they're connected to all these constituents of well-being and its sustainability, and that they're in the Millennium Assessment categorized in these 4 categories of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services, and all of those various interconnections. There is one thing missing from this diagram, however, and I think this is the interaction with the other 3 forms of capital that I mentioned. So it's not that natural capital just flows directly into sustainable well-being, but it requires an interaction, with human-built and social capital. And I think this is the challenge going forward. How do we understand that complex interaction in different places in time and space, and how to create that sustainable human well-being and use those assets appropriately, and understand to what extent does natural capital contribute to that sustainable well-being. So there's been a lot of growing interest in this idea of ecosystem services. You may have heard of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's really a mouthful, but it's kind of the IPCC of the Biodiversity Convention that's been creating assessments like the IPCC over the years. Francesco mentioned the Blue Planet Prize, which I shared last year with IPBES. And I think recognizing the growing importance of this idea of ecosystem services and their management to moving forward and solving our environmental and social problems. There's also the Ecosystem Services Partnership, which is a growing group like this one of practitioners and researchers in this field of ecosystem services. If you want to learn more about that, take a look at their website. And certainly the interest in academic research in ecosystem services has been growing exponentially. This is from the number of documents in Scopus on this topic. You can see there's now almost 7,000 articles a year published on this topic. Almost 60,000 have been published so far, and it's still rapidly growing. The most highly cited of those is this one, which Francesco was maybe alluding to, that we did back in 1997, seems like a long time ago now, but where we tried to estimate, with the information that we had at the time, the total value of 17 different ecosystem services across 16 different biomes, and we came up with which admittedly conservative estimate of much more than global GDP at the time. So I think this sort of kicked off a lot of interest in this topic. We made the point that these services were not small externalities, as I think the economic community was considering at the time, but these were a bigger contribution to our well-being and its sustainability than all of the things that are captured in GDP. We managed to get the cover of the magazine, which was great, but we didn't control exactly what they put on the cover, and they said pricing the planet, and we really didn't mean pricing as much as we meant valuing in a more comprehensive way, and recognizing the difference between market exchange values and prices and sort of non-market valuation of these ecosystem services. And I think that's led to some ongoing confusion about what this kind of valuation exercise does. But the question is, well, did that have any policy influence at all. You know, people other than Francesco really recognize how important this paper was. And I found this paper in Nature recently where they looked at the research papers that were most highly cited in policy documents, not just in the academic literature, but in all of the policy documents they could find. And it turns out that if you look down at the list on the left was the top 10 of those that were cited in policy documents. The top 8 were more straight economics kinds of articles. But the bottom 2, number 9 was Elinor Ostrom's work on governing the commons. And number 10 was the paper I just referred to. And if you look at the right-hand column, if you eliminate the sort of economics journals or articles, then those are the top 2. And the one about the safe operating space was number 10 on that longer list. So I think these studies are having an impact. You know, you don't really see it in the short term, but eventually I think they do come around and show up in policy decisions and policy documents. And why is that? I think there's a growing use for this idea of ecosystem services and their valuation. And there's a list on the left there of some of the uses from raising awareness and interest. I think that was maybe the main purpose of the 1997 paper. But they're increasingly being used now for national income and well-being accounts and to modify those. I'll say a little bit more about that, for specific policy analysis, you know, urban and regional land use planning. How do we maximize the value of these landscapes, recognizing how much ecosystem services are actually contributing. This idea of payment for ecosystem services and those kinds of schemes and mechanisms. This idea of full cost accounting. I mean, we know that everything that we buy in the market is not we're not getting the true price or the true cost. And so because of the magnitude of the externalities that these production processes are generating. So can we begin to look at what the full cost might be and how that might change decisions that everybody makes. And this idea of common asset trust or common asset management. How do we manage these kinds of services in a way that I think is more appropriate to their characteristics? Okay. So, and there's a whole range of valuation techniques that have been used to estimate the contribution of these services. I'll give you a quick example of this first one of avoided costs, which is pretty straightforward and easy to imagine. You know, the costs that are avoided because we have these systems, and if we didn't have them, we'd have much larger costs. But I think there's a lot of new research going on, particularly in group valuation. You know, so how do we, if we're talking about ecosystem services that are common goods, do we want to use individual assessments of what people think their value is, or do we want to use community assessments? And I think this might apply to the subjective well-being assessments as well. You know, do you want to have individual assessments of subjective well-being, or could you get a deliberative group together and say what is, you know, the well-being of the community as a group? So that kind of group evaluation process, this idea of systems modeling, how do we actually look at the longer-term dynamics and integration of these systems? So there's, you know, this is an active research field going forward. I think there's several misconceptions about this valuation of ecosystem services that have persisted for some reason. I'll just read through this list quickly, but you know, the people often say, well, this is just an anthropocentric concept. I don't think it is an anthropocentric or centric in any sense. I think it's a systems level concept that tries to look at how these services are connected with human well-being in a much more integrated way, in a dynamic way. That economics is not just the market. Obviously, the market's just one institution that we've developed to allocate rival and excludable goods and services largely, and we're talking about non-marketed services. Valuation is not the same as privatization or commodification or trading. Those are two separate things, you know, and I don't think we want to privatize these natural capital or the services it produces. But that doesn't mean that valuation is a direct path to that, or that it's important for other purposes. expressing these values in monetary units is not the same thing as market or exchange values. We're not talking about, we're talking about non-market values. And this idea of intrinsic values is more about rights than it is about valuation. So we should have rights to natural systems. They should be protected for that reason. That's not in conflict with the idea of looking at the relative instrumental value of these services. It's really complementary. Okay. And also, I think we can't avoid this valuation. Every time we make a decision about ecosystems in the real world of trade-offs, then we're implicitly making a valuation decision. So we're really talking about making those decisions more explicit, more transparent, and more useful in policy. And also, I think our approach to valuation needs to be expanded quite a bit. The conventional economic approach is based on the goal of economic efficiency that relies on current individual preferences. It uses willingness to pay, basic kinds of approaches. There are lots of issues with that in its own right, but still, I think we need to go beyond that and look at what is the contribution to fairness and what is the contribution to sustainability of these ecosystem services, which will take different approaches, looking more at community preferences, looking more at whole system dynamics and modeling with precaution going forward. So this, like I said, I think there's a lot of room for additional research in these areas. I'll run through a quick example of something we've done recently, which I think is kind of a good indication of where things are now with this ability to value some of these services. And this is a study we did of the global value of coastal wetlands for storm protection. So to do that, well, we know that these coastal wetlands do protect coastal infrastructure from storms in various ways, and we know that, and we have a good database on where all of these storms occurred. So we have data back to 1900, really, for every year. This is just for the year 2003, of all of the tropical storms that occurred that year by category, what their tracks were. So we have a huge database there. So for each of those storms, we could look at the swath of the storm, the area of wetlands in the swath, the area of the infrastructure in the swath. In this case, we used nighttime satellite imagery to kind of downscale that so we can get a more spatially explicit idea of and we know that the amount of damage that each storm caused, and we know how big the storm was. So we can build a regression model that takes all those factors into account, and we can use that to then estimate the avoided damage. How much more or less damage would there have been if we had more or less wetlands occurring. And we can, then use that information to produce these global estimates, spatially explicit, so where and by how much are these wetlands valuable for storm protection. And we estimated globally that total value was about $450 billion a year in avoided costs. Storms are getting bigger, more frequent because of climate change. That value is only going to increase. And from a policy perspective, coastal communities are faced with the decision, do we want to build a seawall to protect, against increasing storms, or do we want to restore or protect, enlarge our coastal wetlands? And I think the argument here that this nature-based solution, and there are many other kinds of nature-based solutions that are going to be much more cost-effective, because you get not only storm protection, but you also get all the other ecosystem services that I mentioned. So anyway, and on the national income accounting side of things, many countries these days are beginning to incorporate ecosystem services into their what's called the system of environmental and economic accounts. So they're now incorporating the value of ecosystem services. This is just an example of what Australia is doing, and it turns out that there are many countries that are beginning to use this SIA process to implement ecosystem services into their national accounting system. So it's getting a bit beyond just GDP. I think it's not everything that we need, as I'll show, but at least it's beginning to start implementing some of these things into the national accounting and recognize the value of those natural systems. China has begun to do what they call gross ecosystem product, which is basically this approach that I've been talking about to do just that at the national scale. So there's that kind of emphasis. We've been involved, this is an effort to collect all of these studies that I showed before and the value of the different services that they're producing, the ecosystem services valuation database. I think they have more than 12,000 individual valuation estimates now in this database, and it's rapidly increasing. It's something that's open access and that people could use to do estimates of the value of these services in various contexts. We used an earlier version of this to look at this earlier version, which looked at how those values had changed over time and the sort of range of estimates for different biomes in terms of the total monetary value of these ecosystem services. You can see that coastal systems are quite high in their contributions. And we use those estimates to then say, well, what had changed between 1997 and 2014 in this case? And we estimated that largely because of land use change over that time period, that we've lost about $20 trillion worth of ecosystem services because of deforestation, because of loss of coral reefs, because of loss of coastal wetlands. Yeah, right. Sorry, I'll try to speed it up a little bit. Anyway, and you can look at scenarios into the future and how that might be affected if we stick with our conventional business as usual, upper left scenario versus if we do policy reform or this great transition, which involves really being serious about how we restore and revalue those wetlands. So we could restore those things. Okay, so a little bit more on social capital, but I think is also equally important, as I said, and that equitable distribution is essential to social capital and quality of life. This is from a study by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, you're probably familiar with, on the relationship between income inequality and a whole range of social problems. We know that there's a strong relationship there, and we know that GDP was never designed to cover any of these issues. This is the quote from Simon Kuznets you probably heard before. So we've known about that from the beginning when GDP was defined, and yet we're still addicted to this use of GDP as our primary policy goal. But it's time to leave that behind. And there are a lot of alternatives. This is just a subset that we pointed to into these three categories. The top one in green are efforts to modify GDP in some way in order to get past some of these problems. The middle ones are direct surveys of life satisfaction, like the World Value Survey. And the bottom ones are indices that are built up from multiple components, including the OECD Better Life Index, the Human Development Index. I'm sure you're familiar with all of these, right? Oh yeah, and certainly one of them is this, the World Happiness Report and how it reports the life satisfaction scores across all these different countries every year, and also tries to explain the variation across countries with these different factors, and showing that GDP per capita contributes maybe 10-15% of that. Notice that the environment is not included as one of their variables. So I'm going to encourage Richard and others to try to throw that in maybe to one of the next assessments. And we've heard a lot about subjective well-being. I'm not sure you've heard that much about the genuine progress indicator as an alternative to GDP, but I think it's relevant because it does relate to this idea of defensive expenditures or defensive consumption. So it starts with personal consumption expenditures, but then it weights those by income distribution to get at the equity effects. It adds a few things that are left out that should be included, like the value of household labor and volunteer work. And then it subtracts a bunch of things that are really defensive expenditures, the cost of crime. We don't want more crime. If we're spending more on police, we're just defending ourselves against security problems. And so there's a whole range of natural and social capital defensive expenditures that are included and that are subtracted then from the personal consumption expenditures. This has been done for a number of countries. We put together a global assessment not too long ago, and this compares GDP per capita, the top line, with this GPI per capita, the bottom line. And you can see that, up until perhaps 1980 or so, or the late 70s, we had true economic growth, but after that we had what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth. The economy's growing, it's not really economic because it's not improving genuine progress when you subtract out the effects of increasing inequality and all of these damages, the side effects of this increasing GDP. So we've been following the wrong lead for quite a few decades. And more recently, we had a class at UCL, and the students in the class are listed down there, where we tried to say, well, let's expand that and look at all of the alternatives to GDP that have been collected. And we ended up with 218 alternatives to GDP at multiple scales. And our contention was, this is a blessing and a curse. I mean, it's a blessing because there's so many people who recognize that GDP is not the right thing to be measuring. We need to do something different. I think you've all been involved in probably one or the other of one of these 218 alternatives. But it's a curse because there are so many of them and there's no real consensus being built. So how do we build that consensus on societal well-being in order to move beyond GDP? I think that's kind of the missing element. How do we make it clear that we do know what well-being looks like, and we can kind of agree to the extent that we can move it forward. So how do we do that? Well, we use some sort of large language model kinds of techniques, some AI techniques, to try to quantify how similar are all of these 218 different indicators. I won't go into the details on this one, but the bottom line is those dots are all the 218 different indicators, and they all have a different number of components. On the x-axis, on the y-axis is how similar are they to all of the other indicators in the database. And you can see that there is kind of a sweet spot in the plot, where at first, up till about 20 or so, you get a very steep, increase in overall similarity if you have more components in your database, and then it sort of levels off more, and you get still increasing, but at a lower rate, increases in similarity. And so, our argument is, we could come up with a list of components that should go into an indicator that represents the agreement across all of these 218 at different numbers of components wherever you wanted to stop, but that 20 represents some kind of sweet spot in this diagram, and you can see that the Canadian quality of life framework is sort of right at that sweet spot. Some of the other ones are also sort of near the top of that curve, but with more components in their indicator. So, if you look at just the synthesizing indicator with, in this case, we boiled it down to 19 components, including life status. And so this represents all of the components that were most similar across all of the 218 indicators that we looked at. and that include the human, social, built, and natural capital components, sort of in a more balanced way. And you see that these components, I'm sure you'll see, are quite similar to many of the things that we do. This is part of a project called Merge, which is a Horizon 2020 EU project that includes a range of researchers and policy areas, et cetera. And I think one of the other main ideas here is that just changing the metrics is not going to be enough to move us away from GDP, that primarily we need to change our social goals, and that the metrics and the underlying models, I think, also need to change. You know, the GDP is underlined by the system of national accounts, the input-output structure of the economy. We need a much more dynamic modeling framework that can look into the future, that can include our natural and social capital assets, et cetera. So I think it's that whole regime that needs to change in order to make the changes that we're looking for. And then I'll end with this idea of the addiction to growth, because in order to break this, to create the sustainable economy, it's going to require breaking this addiction to the growth at all cost paradigm. And we did some work with some psychologists looking at what works at the individual scale to overcome addictions, and could we learn anything from that? And it turns out that there's a therapy called motivational interviewing, which some of you may have heard of. Has anybody heard of this or ever used this therapy? Okay, cool. You read the book. So instead of confronting addicts with the problem, it engages them in a discussion of their life goals. You know, what do they want to achieve with their life? What's their vision for their own personal future? And once that's established, then that can help motivate the difficult changes that are needed. So the obvious analogy to that is, how do we build a shared vision of our societal goals? The SDGs obviously are a major step in that direction. But I don't think the SDGs have really percolated out to the general public. I don't think a large fraction of the public has ever even heard of the SDGs, much less recognize how big a step it is in generating this societal goals. And well, I won't talk about that one. It's out of time. So we did some surveys, some public opinion surveys of alternative futures. And if you put it into a scenario planning framework, you can say, okay, do we want a world that's, one of these potential alternative futures? And this is from the Great Transition Initiative, and these are sort of archetypical scenarios for the future: business as usual, some sort of policy reform, a great transition that's more about community and well-being versus just GDP growth, and a sort of collapse or fortress world scenario. I think the SDGs are solidly in the community and focus on well-being kind of corner. I think the problem is, how do we communicate those alternatives to the broader public? And I think it's going to take more than simply bullet points. It's going to take really an engagement of the arts and humanities communities. What would those worlds actually look like? What would it be like to live in, the Great Transition world, or the market forces, or the fortress world scenario? So we've done some public opinion surveys, I said, in Australia, looking at describing these four futures, slightly differently worded, and asking people to rank them and say, which of these futures would you prefer to live in? And we get results like this. In this case, it was like 72% ranked the community well-being future, the Great Transition, the SDG future, I think, as being number 1 or 2. We also asked them where they thought the country was headed, and it was very much the free enterprise future. So, and there's been some other surveys similar to that in a group of countries. This one looked at a more simple group of scenarios, just the business as usual or the sustainability scenario. But you can see that by far in all countries, the sustainable scenario is much more preferred to the business as usual scenario. And there's been some recent surveys by the Earth for All study that asked Europeans that whether they were support for this well-being economy among those surveyed. And there's high support for the idea that the economy should be about more than, it should be about more about health and well-being rather than just GDP growth. So, finally, what it's going to take, though, to move in that direction. Once we've established that shared vision, I think it's going to take a movement. It's going to take an alliance. And you've heard about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. I think the goal of that and other organizations is how do we bring together all of the movements and individuals that are headed in the same direction. And so you could take a look at what's going on there. And I'm sure that there will be some connection going forward between this qual and we all, because I think we share a lot of the same agenda, and with a really large number of other organizations and individuals. So I think this recognition that, in fact, there already is quite a shared vision that's out there. It's just not really been communicated back to the public. So how do we continue to build that shared vision? How do we communicate it back to the public? And how do we use that, I think, to make the transition that we're really looking for? And I think that transition may take a crisis, and I think we're in the middle of a crisis right now, and multiple crises. But that crisis opens the door for new ideas like the ones we're talking about, and it opens the door for the creation of movements like we've just been talking about, which can then overcome the crisis and create the kind of world that we're talking about, the sustainable and desirable future. And I'll end with a plug for a couple of books that go into more detail on all of this, including the one that Francesco pointed to, but we also did a collection of articles on Toward an Integrated Science of Wellbeing at multiple scales. It might be more directly interesting for this crowd. And also the sort of what ecological economics is saying about this sustainable well-being futures. And we're also starting a new master's program that some people might be interested in going forward on prosperity, people, and planet. Okay, I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There was plenty to think about. So I open the floor. I ask all of you to please be very, very short and direct with questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to hear some of your thoughts on kind of alternatives we might put in practice, even if small, because sometimes what I feel is that we discuss a lot the need for a change, but then we are embedded in the very system. For instance, academic profession is very embedded in more is better paradigm. So what kind of examples can we put in practice to be case studies that might lead a change?
Yeah, well, I think that's where the addiction metaphor, I think, comes in. Because we get stuck, in the way of doing things that we're doing, and we don't recognize that it's not really getting us out of the trap that we're in. And so the analogy with motivational interviewing is we first have to step back and say, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And so if you're trying to achieve something beyond just your academic exercise and some change in the real world, what would that look like? And I'm arguing that it's going to take a movement. So I think it's going to take collaborating, with a much broader group of individuals than just, your narrow academic discipline. So interdisciplinary comes first, but then, transdisciplinary and beyond, and sort of help to build this shared vision. I think that we can use to motivate the changes. If you want to look, yeah, no, go ahead. Does that answer the question, or you?
I was just wondering if you have any knowledge of practical experiments in the ground that produce an alternative.
Exactly what you're referring to. Practical experiments of what?
Sorry if I step in. I must be the nastiest chair. And I suggest to continue this conversation.
We can talk about this later, yeah.
So that we give chances to other people to ask questions. And I would propose, if you don't mind, to collect 2 or 3 questions at a time so we can speed it up, okay?
Yeah.
So there is Jonas and then Maria and...
So thanks a lot for your very inspiring and interesting presentation. So people seem to agree on sustainable well-being as the goal, but are they ready to make the required changes? And do you have an idea what to do to, to overcome this? For example, it appears that like meat eating would be very central, like reducing eating meat, but that, for example, seems to be a difficult issue. Thanks.
Thank you. I was wondering, maybe on a bit of a different scale, I was wondering about differences between well-being and welfare and how profound they're in changing the paradigm, and another one on value versus price. I was just wondering, as you're describing it all, do you find it was a mistake, or would you regret publishing that first paper in the sense of how much pushback and misinterpretation it has caused? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for outlining those 200 or so measures. There is a mushrooming of beyond GDP attempted measures, and now possibly also a mushrooming of harmonization efforts. What are your thoughts on how we can move faster to a beyond GDP agreed metric that may be imperfect, but at least is there? Do you want me to repeat? I said, how can we move faster towards some measure?
Thanks. I hear so often complaints about the direction of the economy or the objective of the economy and so on. And it seems that there's often a confusion between that and collective action problems. So, at the global level, global ecological problems are going to continue coming at us. And I wonder whether you think we oughtn't to be spending some resources solving the meta problem of not having a global enforcement body, even if that's not feasible for 50, 100 years.
Okay, maybe I could start with that one, because I think it is a collective action problem. I think that the changing the goal of the economy is recognizing that I think the majority of people on the planet are not happy with the way things are going and the way the economy is going. I think there's some survey evidence to back that up. There was an interesting study done in the US where they looked at 1,700 different policy decisions that were made and whether those were in favor of the public opinion at the time or in favor of special interest opinion at the time. And the number of those that were in favor of public opinion was 0. So it's the special interests that are controlling the direction of the economy these days. And it's not reflecting, the societal's, the democratic process. It's not really a democratic process. It's been said that, democracy is a good idea and we ought to try it. So this idea of, deliberative democracy, citizen assemblies, how can we actually get some democratic decision-making to overcome this, to make collective decisions in a much more democratic and informed way. So I think it is a crisis of collective decision-making and democracy underlying that. How do we move faster? I wish I knew the answer to that one, but I think, getting people to recognize that I think there is already this broad agreement on a different vision. One thing we're going to try like I said, I think we need to engage the arts and humanities communities to engage people in thinking about alternative futures and building this shared vision. So we're going to create a video contest where we ask people to create short videos of these 4 alternative futures to describe how people, would live in those different futures in order to get people kind of much more engaged in that process and get, because like I said, I don't think people even recognize that there is an alternative. They're going with Margaret Thatcher, that it's only society, or there's no society. So I think that could hopefully speed things up. And like I said, we are in a crisis, and I think that those kinds of transitions can often happen relatively quickly and unexpectedly. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not really predicted until it happened. So there's a long buildup. I think we're experiencing that long buildup. We're seeing a crisis situation. I'm convinced that Trump is going to crash, the U.S. economy and maybe the global economy, and that we need to think of that as opening the door for the kinds of things that we're talking about. And when the door opens, we need to be ready with, here's a better alternative. Here's a way to have a sustainable well-being future. And that crash is going to sort of take away, like World War II did, a lot of the built infrastructure and the addiction that we're in. It's like so I think it could happen much faster than we think. But I think our challenge is to be ready when that opportunity arises. And what was the other one that I didn't quite catch?
Maria.
Yeah.
Oh, well, whether you have regretted your first publication on the global value of ecosystem services because it has created a lot of pushback and misinterpretation.
I don't regret it, and even though it has created discussion and controversy, and I think that's actually helped to stimulate additional research in the area, and that was our intention and when we published it. We didn't say this is the answer. We said, hey, look, if you do this, you get this kind of answer, and hey, it's quite different than what we or others expected, and obviously we didn't do it perfectly, and so it's generated a lot of additional research and action in this area, which was good. So, yeah. Thanks.
So we are. So we are exactly on delay. I would still like to give a chance for another round of questions, quick questions. Oh, Lolo. Maybe you should come back also next year. Okay, I see Philip here, the lady, and yes, okay, over there.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wonder if you were blaming the victim. And the victim are the consumers, us, because of what we spend our money on. And our addiction is the problem that you begin with. But our addiction is central to the survival and the growth of the large corporations that control so much of what we do and what happens to the planet. So my question is, to what extent have you been talking to the corporations that make the critical decisions that influence our lives?
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. I would like to ask you that if you could choose one policy measure to apply worldwide, what would that policy be?
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I wondered if you had any ideas on how to link the ecosystem services and natural capital accounting in general also to the concept of tipping points and the planetary boundaries.
Interesting. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I wonder, for a country like India, population is the biggest issue, and to balance between the different regions, it becomes difficult. For a country like Bhutan, it is possible to balance things because it's a small country. But for a country where resources are scarce and people are driving towards improving GDP, of course, we have been questioning it. Yet, what is an alternative for the larger countries where population is huge? Thank you.
Okay. I think for all countries, we need to look at not GDP as it's currently formulated, but at minimum, we need to look at GDP minus defensive expenditures. You know, like what's the real contribution to well-being? So if we start looking at that, and getting closer to this idea of well-being rather than simply production, because a lot of our production, as we found out, is not necessary for well-being, and it gets back to the other question. Like we're not blaming the victim; we're saying that we are all victims of the system that we're embedded in, because of the way it's organized, the way it's functioning, and the fact that it's controlled largely by larger interest groups that don't represent what people really want. And I think there's been a lot of research, demonstrated at this conference that we don't need as much consumption to be equally or even have a higher level of well-being. So making that sort of information apparent and injected into the system, I think, is what we're ultimately after. But the reason it's not, I think, is because we are trapped in this current system, and those interest groups are keeping us going. The fossil fuel sector, the pharmaceutical sector, they don't want things to change, and so they're providing. ExxonMobil has been described as the world's largest producer of misinformation. So, and their subsidies are huge, and so we need to break out of that cycle of addiction. And I think I'm not saying I know how to do it, but I think this idea of thinking of it as an addiction and thinking of then what could the therapy be, how do we need to really frame the argument in a way that will help us to overcome that? Because simply pointing out that we're going in the wrong direction and we have to change, is not enough, I think, right? Or at least it hasn't been enough. We've known that there's been a problem for decades, and we've known the solution for a long time, but we haven't changed in the same way that, as long as the addict keeps getting, the drug, it's gonna, everything's. The idea that it's that people are much more averse to losing something than they are to gaining something of equal value. So overcoming these habitual, consumption patterns that people are in is obviously going to be difficult, and you have to have something positive on the other side. If you just say, stop smoking, that's difficult. But if you say, if you stop smoking, you're going to achieve this much higher level of health. You're going to have to stop coughing. You're going to be much better off. It can be enough to make the transition or to overcome that really positive feedback loop that's there. Was there one more that I forgot? I don't remember.
The policy measure here. The policy measure that you would choose to apply worldwide.
Policy measures. Well, like I said, I think the first thing to do is to change the goal. So if we can establish at the policy level that the goal of governments is to create sustainable well-being, then I think that would be the right first step. And I think there are some governments that are doing that. So the well-being economy governments, is a small subset that have basically made that commitment. Starting with Scotland and Wales and Iceland and Finland and New Zealand and even Canada. Problem is the governments that made that commitment initially are no longer in power, and so we have other governments have kind of watered it down a bit. But I think it would be possible, for governments to get on board with that commitment and say our goal is sustainable well-being. How does that change our policies? Bhutan has really done that in practice. Their policies that don't conform to the gross national happiness, idea are ones that are not followed. I heard a story working with them that, when they originally were asked to join the WTO, their initial reaction was, yeah, it sounds great. We'll join the WTO, we'll have more trade, blah, blah, blah. And then they sat down and said, well, let's put that through the gross national happiness screen. Is that going to actually improve any of their 9 domains that they had in the gross national happiness screen? And they said, nah, not really. So they didn't join. Yeah, so you could do that sort of thing on a larger scale with more governments, and maybe the European Union is kind of headed in that direction, or might be headed in that direction.
Or it was. Let's hope it resumes.
Yeah.
We really need to close this, but I want to give a last chance for a question to Alonso Plough.
I didn't realize I'd be the last one. I would have come up with something more. It's on the issue. It's on the framing of addiction, and coming from a health perspective, addiction or substance use disorder. It's a relapsing chronic condition. It's very, so to get at a core of addiction, I mean, motivational interviewing kind of gets you on the course to recognizing, oh, there's a problem. And then it takes a variety of medical community support, familial support, governmental support around this recovery trajectory. I mean, and I agree that we have a societal addiction, but addictions aren't treated by a flash of recognition. They are treated by a longitudinal, multiple kind of set of interventions and awareness, because the basic biology of the problem doesn't go away. I would just kind of suggest that the analogy is a little more complex.
I agree. Maybe we should talk later, and we could flesh it out a bit. But I think, yeah, that seems to be the first step, is to recognize that there is a problem, and that that we need to establish what our goals are. But then beyond that, actually making the transition is difficult with relapses, and requires, I think, like I said, the movement, to be established. And it's probably not going to be easy, and it probably will require a crisis, as it I think often does in the case of addiction therapy. You have to really see that things have changed for the worse in order to make those difficult changes. So I think it's still a good metaphor, though.